The combination lock clicked softly as the steel door swung open, revealing stacks of documents that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my marriage. But inside that hidden safe wasn't just evidence of my husband's betrayal, it was proof of something so much bigger, so much darker that it would transform me from a heartbroken wife into someone I never imagined I could become. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days after Brandon told me he wanted a divorce, I was mechanically folding his clothes into cardboard boxes when I noticed something odd about our bedroom closet. The back wall didn't quite align with the house's layout. I'd lived in this Lake Oswego home for 8 years. Yet somehow I'd never really examined the space behind Brandon's extensive suit collection. Running my fingers along the wall, I discovered a small, almost invisible seam. With gentle pressure, a narrow panel slid sideways, revealing a compact digital safe embedded in the wall. My breath caught in my throat. 8 years of marriage, and my husband had maintained a secret compartment mere feet from where I slept every night. The safe's LED display blinked patiently, waiting for a 6-digit code. My mind raced through possibilities. Our anniversary. His birthday. My birthday. Nothing worked. Then, almost without thinking, I entered the date he'd been promoted to senior partner at Pacific Northwest Logistics. The lock disengaged with a soft mechanical whisper. What I found inside made my hands shake so violently I nearly dropped everything onto the hardwood floor. Bank statements showed accounts I'd never seen, containing hundreds of thousands of dollars, property deeds for buildings I didn't know we owned, corporate documents listing Brandon as the secret owner of 3 shell companies, and beneath it all, a leather portfolio containing photographs and documents that revealed the true scope of what I'd stumbled into. The photographs showed Brandon with various business associates at what appeared to be exclusive gatherings. But these weren't typical corporate events. The settings looked more like private estate meetings, with participants who seemed far removed from the logistics industry Brandon claimed to work in. Men in expensive suits examining briefcases full of cash. Women in evening wear who looked distinctly uncomfortable, their smiles not reaching their eyes. My stomach lurched as I recognized some faces from Portland's social pages. City council members, prominent business owners, even a federal judge I'd seen featured in the local newspaper. Whatever Brandon was involved in, it extended far beyond our suburban marriage into the highest levels of Pacific Northwest society. One document particularly caught my attention. It was a partnership agreement dated just 2 months after our wedding, establishing something called Northwest Development Consortium. Brandon's signature appeared alongside several others I didn't recognize, but the financial projections outlined in the paperwork made my head spin. Millions of dollars in projected revenues from special services and exclusive client management. The most disturbing discovery came in a manila envelope marked insurance policy. Inside were detailed dossiers on at least a dozen individuals, complete with photographs, personal information, family details, and what could only be described as compromising evidence, financial indiscretions, extramarital affairs, tax evasion, immigration violations, a comprehensive collection of secrets that could destroy lives and careers. My own name appeared on one of the folders. The file on me was thinner than the others, but contained information that made my blood run cold. Photographs of me leaving my therapist's office during a particularly difficult period 3 years ago when I'd been struggling with anxiety. Copies of my medical records, somehow obtained without my knowledge. Financial records tracking every purchase I'd made, every donation I'd given, every subscription I'd maintained. Even transcripts of phone conversations I'd had with my sister in California, discussing my growing concerns about Brandon's increasingly distant behavior. At the bottom of my file was a handwritten note in Brandon's familiar script: contingency plan, if marriage becomes liability. Full psychological profile suggests subject will retreat rather than fight. Minimal risk of exposure if handled properly. I read those words 3 times before their meaning fully penetrated. Brandon hadn't just been planning our divorce, he'd been preparing for it as a strategic business decision, complete with psychological manipulation to ensure I would disappear quietly without asking inconvenient questions. Sitting on our bedroom floor, surrounded by evidence of betrayals I couldn't yet fully comprehend, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my life had been carefully orchestrated fiction. The successful logistics company Brandon claimed to manage was apparently just one facet of a much larger operation that seemed to involve blackmail, money laundering, and what could only be described as organized criminal activity. The man I'd shared a bed with for 8 years wasn't just unfaithful, he was dangerous, and according to his own notes, he considered me a potential threat that needed to be neutralized. My phone buzzed with a text message from Brandon. "Working late again tonight. Don't wait up. We'll talk more about the divorce arrangements tomorrow." For 8 years, those working late messages had been a source of growing loneliness and resentment. Now they took on an entirely different meaning. Tonight, while Brandon assumed I was home grieving the end of our marriage, I would be using the time to understand exactly what I'd discovered and figure out how to protect myself from whatever came next. The first step was documenting everything. Using my phone, I photographed every document, every photograph, every page of evidence in that safe. The process took nearly 2 hours, during which I jumped at every small sound from our normally quiet neighborhood. Every car door slamming, every dog barking, every gust of wind rattling the windows made me wonder if Brandon had somehow discovered my intrusion. By the time I finished photographing the contents, my phone's memory was nearly full, and my understanding of the situation had crystallized into cold, hard clarity. This wasn't about a failing marriage or even typical infidelity. This was about survival. Brandon's psychological profile of me suggested I would retreat rather than fight, that I posed minimal risk of exposure. 8 years ago, he might have been right. The woman who'd married him had been trusting, perhaps even naive, willing to overlook inconsistency in favor of maintaining peace. But sitting in that bedroom, surrounded by evidence of calculated deception and manipulation, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The scared, confused woman who'd been packing divorce boxes that morning was gone. In her place was someone colder, more focused, and absolutely determined to ensure that Brandon's psychological profile proved to be spectacularly wrong. As I carefully returned everything to the safe and reset the lock, I began formulating a plan. If Brandon thought he could manipulate me into quiet submission while protecting his criminal enterprise, he was about to learn just how badly he'd miscalculated. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with and find allies who could help me navigate waters far more dangerous than a simple divorce. The next morning, I called in sick to my job at the nonprofit Arts Foundation where I'd worked for the past 5 years. Instead of going to the office, I drove to a coffee shop in downtown Portland, far from our Lake Oswego neighborhood where Brandon's associates might recognize me. Using the cafe's Wi-Fi and a laptop I'd purchased that morning with cash, I began researching the names and companies I'd found in Brandon's secret document. What I discovered made the safe's contents seem like just the tip of an iceberg that extended far deeper into Portland's power structure than I'd imagined. Northwest Development Consortium appeared in property records throughout the Pacific Northwest, always as a silent partner in developments that seemed to benefit from unusually favorable zoning decisions and expedited permit approvals. The same names that appeared on Brandon's partnership documents showed up in campaign contribution records for local politicians, in membership lists for exclusive clubs, and in charitable foundation boards that wielded significant influence over city planning decisions. Cross-referencing the photographs from the safe with Portland's society pages revealed a network of connections that painted a disturbing picture. These weren't random business associates. They were a carefully coordinated group that seemed to have infiltrated every level of local government and business leadership. The federal judge, whose photo I'd recognized, was the same one who had overseen several high-profile cases involving zoning disputes and environmental regulations, cases that had been decided in ways that directly benefited properties owned by companies linked to Northwest Development Consortium. The city council members in Brandon's photographs had voted on development projects that generated millions in profits for consortium partners. As I dug deeper into public records, a pattern emerged that made my discovery of the safe seem almost providential. An investigative journalist, named Marcus Rivera, had been working on a series of articles about corruption in Portland's development industry. His most recent piece, published just 6 months ago, had raised questions about the very same types of suspicious zoning decisions and permit approvals that seemed to benefit Brandon's network. Rivera's articles suggested he was close to uncovering something significant, but they'd stopped abruptly. A brief search revealed that Marcus Rivera had been involved in a serious car accident 3 months ago, just weeks after his last article about development corruption was published. He was alive but had suffered injuries severe enough to put his investigative work on indefinite hold. The timing felt too convenient to be coincidental. If Brandon's organization was willing to maintain detailed blackmail files on prominent citizens, they might also be capable of eliminating threats to their operation through more direct means. The thought that I might now pose a similar threat sent a chill through me, but it also strengthened my resolve. By late afternoon, I'd compiled enough information to understand that I was dealing with something far beyond the scope of a typical divorce attorney. This required someone with experience in criminal law, someone who wouldn't be intimidated by powerful opponents, and someone who could help me navigate the dangerous territory I'd stumbled into. A search for criminal defense attorneys who specialized in corruption cases led me to Diana Walsh, a former federal prosecutor who'd made a name for herself taking on organized crime and political corruption. Her law firm, Walsh & Associates, operated out of a sleek downtown Portland high-rise, and her biography suggested exactly the kind of expertise I needed. But first, I needed to ensure my own safety. If Brandon's psychological profile was wrong about my willingness to fight, it might also be wrong about other aspects of how I'd respond to discovering his secrets. I couldn't risk him realizing what I knew until I was prepared for whatever retaliation might follow. That evening, when Brandon returned home at his usual late hour, I was in bed reading, or at least pretending to read. He seemed slightly more attentive than he'd been in recent months, perhaps feeling guilt about the divorce announcement, or relief that the deception would soon be over. "How was your day?" he asked, loosening his tie in front of our bedroom mirror. "Difficult," I replied honestly. "I started packing some of your things." He nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "I know this isn't easy, Natalie, but it's better for both of us, in the long run." Watching him deliver those words with apparent sincerity, knowing what I now knew about his true motivations, was almost surreal. The man standing before me wasn't just ending our marriage, he was executing a business decision designed to eliminate a potential threat to a criminal enterprise. "I've been thinking about what you said about keeping things amicable," I continued, testing how he'd respond. "Maybe we should handle this quietly, without getting lawyers too involved." Brandon's shoulders relaxed slightly. "That would be ideal. Legal fees just eat up money that could go toward helping both of us start fresh." "Perfect." He was expecting exactly the kind of compliant, non-confrontational response his psychological profile had predicted. As long as he believed I was following his script, I would have time to prepare my own strategy. "I'll need a few days to process everything," I added. "Maybe we should avoid making any major decisions until I've had time to adjust." "Of course," Brandon agreed, his relief now obvious. "Take all the time you need." As he headed toward the bathroom for his nightly shower, I fought to keep my expression neutral. In his mind, the conversation had just confirmed that his carefully planned manipulation was working perfectly. He had no idea that instead of buying time to grieve, I was buying time to build a case that would bring down not just him, but potentially an entire network of corruption that had infected Portland's power structure. The woman Brandon thought he knew would have spent the next few days crying and accepting her fate. The woman I was becoming had already scheduled a meeting with a criminal defense attorney and begun planning a counterattack that would ensure his psychological profile proved to be the most expensive mistake he'd ever made. That night, as Brandon slept peacefully beside me, apparently content with how smoothly his divorce strategy was proceeding, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about Marcus Rivera. Tomorrow I would reach out to the investigative journalist who'd come too close to the truth for someone's comfort. If my suspicions were correct, Marcus and I had more in common than either of us yet realized, and together we might have exactly what was needed to expose the conspiracy that had been hiding in plain sight throughout Portland's most respectable circle. The game Brandon thought he was winning had only just begun. Marcus Rivera answered his phone on the second ring, his voice slightly hoarse but alert. When I explained who I was, and mentioned that I had information related to his investigation into Portland development corruption, the line went silent for nearly 10 seconds. "Where did you get this number?" he asked finally. "Your articles are still online. Your contact information was listed at the bottom of your last piece about zoning irregularities." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "I believe I've discovered evidence that connects to your investigation." Another pause. "Ms. Hoffman, I'm going to be direct with you. 3 months ago, my car's brake lines were severed while I was parked outside a city council member's office. The accident wasn't an accident. If you're calling me because you've stumbled into something related to what I was investigating, you need to understand that these people don't hesitate to eliminate problems." His bluntness was both terrifying and reassuring. At least he understood the stakes involved. "I think they've already identified me as a potential problem. I found documents that suggest they've been monitoring me for years. We shouldn't discuss this over the phone. Do you know Riverside Cafe on Southeast Hawthorne? It's public enough to be safe, but has corners where we can talk privately." 3 hours later, I sat across from Marcus Rivera in a dim corner booth, watching him examine printouts of the photographs I'd taken from Brandon's safe. His injuries from the car accident were more severe than I'd expected. His left arm remained in a partial cast, and careful movements suggested ongoing back problems. But his eyes were sharp and focused as he studied each document with the intensity of someone who understood their significance. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, holding up a photograph of the federal judge meeting with Brandon and several other men around a table covered with cash-filled briefcases. "Judge Harrison, I've been trying to prove his connection to these development decisions for 2 years." Marcus spread several documents across the table, organizing them by date and type. "Your husband wasn't just involved in this conspiracy, Natalie. Based on what you've found, he was coordinating it. Look at these bank routing numbers. They all trace back to accounts controlled by Northwest Development Consortium, and these property deeds show a pattern of purchases made just weeks before favorable zoning decisions were announced." He pulled out a worn notebook and began cross-referencing the documents with his own research. 3 years ago, a community garden in southeast Portland was rezoned for high-density housing. The neighborhood fought it for months, but Judge Harrison ruled that the city had authority to override community objections. 6 weeks later, Northwest Development Consortium purchased the property for a fraction of its post-rezoning value. Marcus flipped through several pages of handwritten notes. The same pattern happened with a historic district in Northwest Portland, a wetland preserve in Beaverton, and a low-income housing complex in Gresham. Each time, zoning changes were approved despite community opposition, and each time, companies connected to Northwest Development Consortium benefited financially. The scope of what Brandon had been orchestrating was staggering. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. How much money are we talking about? Based on these documents and what I already knew, probably $50 to $70 million over the past 5 years. But the money is only part of it. Marcus indicated the blackmail files I'd discovered. These dossiers represent a level of control over local government that goes far beyond simple corruption. They've essentially created a shadow system where legitimate democratic processes are manipulated through fear and extortion. He studied the photograph of city council members meeting with Brandon's group. Councilmember Patricia Zhao voted for every single zoning change that benefited the consortium. According to this file, they have evidence of her accepting bribes from a different development company 3 years ago. Councilmember David Park consistently supported their projects too, and according to his dossier, they know about his gambling debts and the liens against his property. The systematic nature of the corruption was overwhelming. These weren't isolated incidents of individual greed. This was a coordinated effort to subvert Portland's entire development approval process. "What about the women in some of these photographs?" I asked, pointing to several images that showed uncomfortable-looking women at what appeared to be private parties. "They don't look like they're there willingly." Marcus's expression darkened. "I've been investigating that aspect too. There are rumors about certain parties where influential men are provided with entertainment that's then used to create compromising material for future leverage. Some of the women appear to be involved voluntarily, but others, the implications made me feel sick. So they're not just stealing money through development fraud, they're running some kind of organized blackmail operation that includes sexual exploitation. That's what I believe, but proving it has been nearly impossible. The women who might testify are either too scared or too compromised themselves. The men involved have too much power and too much to lose. And anyone who gets too close to exposing the truth ends up having unfortunate accidents. Marcus winced as he reached for his coffee, the movement clearly causing him pain. After my car accident, I received a very polite visit from a man who claimed to represent concerned community members. He suggested that my investigative work was causing unnecessary stress for hardworking public servants, and that perhaps I should focus my journalism on less controversial topics. Did you recognize him from any of these photographs? I didn't then, but I do now. Marcus pointed to a man standing behind Brandon in one of the party photographs, Gregory Walsh. He owns a private security company that contracts with several city departments. According to your husband's documents, Walsh provides more than just standard security service. The name Walsh caught my attention. Any relation to Diana Walsh, the criminal defense attorney? Marcus looked up sharply. Diana is Gregory's sister. They've been estranged for years. She's completely legitimate. Built her reputation prosecuting exactly the kind of cases her brother apparently helps cover up. But if you're planning to approach her, you should know that family connection exists. The revelation complicated my plan to seek legal help from Diana Walsh, but it also presented an opportunity. If she had personal reasons to oppose her brother's activities, she might be even more motivated to help expose the conspiracy. There's something else you need to know, Marcus continued, pulling out his phone and showing me a news article from 2 weeks ago. Dr. Jennifer Kim, a city planning consultant who raised questions about several of these same development projects, was found dead in her apartment, apparent suicide, according to the official report. My blood ran cold as I read the brief article. Dr. Kim had been scheduled to testify before a grand jury investigating irregularities in city planning decisions. Her death had occurred just 3 days before her scheduled testimony. You don't think it was suicide? Jennifer Kim was about to expose systematic corruption in Portland's development approval process. She had documented evidence of bribery, vote manipulation, and fraud. According to friends, she was excited about her upcoming testimony and believed it would lead to real reform. Marcus closed his phone with a bitter expression. Suicidal people don't typically spend their final weeks preparing presentations about civic duty and public service. The pattern was becoming clear. Anyone who threatened to expose Brandon's conspiracy faced intimidation, accidents, or worse, and now I possessed evidence that could destroy the entire network. Marcus, I need to ask you something direct. Based on everything you know about these people, what do you think happens to me when Brandon realizes I've discovered his safe? He was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with the careful assessment of someone who had learned to take threats seriously. Honestly, if they believe you're planning to expose them, you're in serious danger. But if you do nothing, you're also in danger. They've already decided you're a potential liability. That was clear from the file they kept on you. So my options are to run away and spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, or find a way to expose them before they can eliminate the threat I represent. There's a third option, Marcus said carefully. We work together to gather enough evidence to bring federal authorities into this. The corruption crosses state lines, involves federal judges, and the money laundering probably violates multiple federal statutes. If we can build a solid case and get it to the right people, we might be able to bring down the entire network before they realize what's happening. The prospect of taking on such powerful adversaries was terrifying, but the alternative was accepting that Brandon and his associates would control every aspect of my future. What would that involve? Marcus opened his notebook to a fresh page. First, we need to document everything systematically. Your photographs are excellent evidence, but we need to verify details and establish clear connections between specific individuals and specific crimes. Second, we need additional sources who can corroborate what we've found. And third, we need to find federal investigators who aren't compromised by local connections. He paused, considering the magnitude of what he was proposing. I should also mention that if we do this, there's no going back. Once we start actively investigating them, they'll eventually notice. And when they do, both of our lives will be at risk. The weight of the decision settled over me like a heavy blanket. 8 hours ago, my biggest concern had been dividing assets in a divorce. Now I was contemplating whether to risk my life exposing a criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Portland's government and business community. But as I thought about Jennifer Kim's supposed suicide and Marcus's sabotaged car, I realized that the choice had already been made for me. Brandon's psychological profile suggested they expected me to retreat quietly and disappear from their lives without causing problems. That expectation was the only thing currently keeping me safe. The moment they realized I wasn't following their script, my life would be in danger regardless of what I chose to do about their crime. At least by working with Marcus to expose them, I would have some control over the timing and circumstances of that confrontation. "I'm in," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "But we need to be smart about this. Brandon can't suspect anything has changed until we're ready." Marcus smiled for the first time since we'd met. "Then we start with surveillance and verification. Your husband's documents give us targets and timeframes, but we need to catch them in the act of actual crimes. Bribery, money laundering, extortion, activities we can document and prove in court." Over the next 2 hours, we developed a preliminary strategy. Marcus had contacts within federal law enforcement from his previous investigative work, but approaching them would require irrefutable evidence of serious federal crime. The documents from Brandon's safe provided a roadmap, but we needed to witness actual criminal activity. "There's a city council meeting next Tuesday about a controversial rezoning proposal in North Portland," Marcus explained. "According to your husband's calendar, he has meetings scheduled with 3 council members in the 2 days before that meeting. If we can document those meetings and then record how those council members vote, we might be able to establish a clear pattern of corruption." The plan required careful coordination and significant risk. We would need to follow Brandon without him detecting surveillance, document his meetings with public officials, and then prove those meetings influenced official vote. One mistake could expose our investigation and put both of our lives in jeopardy. But as we finalized the details, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose and control over my own destiny. For 8 years I had been living in a reality carefully constructed by Brandon and his associates, never realizing that my entire life was being manipulated. Now, for the first time, I was taking action based on complete information and my own choices. As we prepared to leave the cafe, Marcus pulled out a burner phone and handed it to me. "Only use this to contact me. Assume all your regular communications are being monitored. And Natalie," he paused, his expression serious, "whatever you do, don't let Brandon suspect anything has changed. Your safety depends on maintaining the appearance that you're following his psychological profile exactly." Driving home through Portland's afternoon traffic, I practiced the persona I would need to maintain: the devastated wife, overwhelmed by divorce proceedings, focused on practical concerns rather than asking difficult questions. Brandon would be expecting grief, confusion, and eventual resignation. I would give him exactly what he expected to see while secretly documenting every aspect of his criminal enterprise. The transformation felt surprisingly natural. After 8 years of suppressing doubts and accepting explanations that never quite made sense, I had become skilled at hiding my true thoughts and feelings. Now, instead of protecting Brandon's secrets, I would be using those same skills to expose them. When I arrived home, Brandon was in the kitchen preparing what appeared to be an unusually elaborate dinner. He looked up with a smile that would have seemed genuinely caring if I hadn't spent the afternoon studying photographs of him coordinating criminal conspiracy. "I thought we should have a nice evening together," he said, gesturing toward candles and wine he'd set out on our dining room table. "I know this transition is difficult, and I want us to stay connected as friends." The performance was masterful. Concerned ex-husband, thoughtful and considerate, working to minimize emotional damage during a difficult life change. If I hadn't discovered his safe, I might have been touched by the gesture. "That's very thoughtful," I replied, allowing just the right amount of sadness and gratitude into my voice. "I've been thinking about what you said, about keeping things amicable. You're right that fighting would just make everything harder." Relief flickered across Brandon's features before he suppressed it behind an expression of appropriate solemnity. I'm glad you feel that way. I was worried you might want to hire lawyers and make this more complicated than it needs to be. Perfect. He was confirming that my compliant response was exactly what he'd hoped for. As long as I continued meeting his expectations, he would remain confident that his psychological manipulation was working as planned. Over dinner, Brandon discussed practical matters, with the calm efficiency of someone managing a business transaction. Division of assets, timeline for me finding a new place to live, how we would handle joint accounts and shared responsibility. He had clearly given considerable thought to the logistics of dissolving our marriage in ways that would minimize his exposure and inconvenience. I've been thinking about the house, I said carefully. It holds so many memories. Maybe it would be easier if you kept it and I started completely fresh somewhere new. Brandon's relief was palpable. The house contained his hidden safe, and probably other evidence I hadn't yet discovered. My willingness to walk away from it eliminated a significant complication from his perspective. Are you sure? He asked, though his tone made it clear he hoped I was. I know how much you love this place. I think a clean break might be healthier, I replied. New city, new life, new opportunities. The suggestion that I might leave Portland entirely seemed to please him even more. That makes sense. A fresh start somewhere you can build the life you really want. As we continued discussing my fictional plans to relocate and rebuild, I found myself studying Brandon with new eyes. The man I had married was charming, intelligent, and persuasive, qualities that had attracted me but also made him effective at manipulation and deception. Every gesture, every expression, every word was carefully calculated to produce specific responses and emotions. But now that I understood the performance, I could see the calculation behind it. The slight tension around his eyes when I mentioned anything that deviated from his preferred script. The way he steered conversations away from topics that might prompt inconvenient questions. The careful balance of attention and distance, designed to keep me emotionally engaged, but not overly curious about his activities. The realization was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. For 8 years, I had been responding to careful manipulation rather than genuine emotion. Every major decision in our marriage had been influenced by Brandon's strategic interests, rather than our shared goals and values. Even my own thoughts and feelings had been shaped by his psychological tactics. But that manipulation only worked as long as I remained unaware of it. Now that I could see the mechanics of how Brandon controlled situations and people, I could use that knowledge against him. Every technique he employed to manage my responses could be turned around and used to manage his. As we finished dinner and Brandon began clearing dishes with domestic thoughtfulness that would have seemed sweet yesterday, I mentally rehearsed the role I would need to play over the coming weeks. Grateful for his consideration, focused on practical concerns, eager to move forward with minimal conflict. The performance would require careful attention to detail, but it would also provide perfect cover for the investigation Marcus and I were planning. That night, as Brandon worked in his home office on what he claimed were routine business matters, I lay in bed reviewing everything I'd learned. In less than 24 hours, my understanding of reality had been completely overturned. The man sleeping beside me wasn't just ending our marriage, he was executing a strategy to eliminate a security risk to a criminal enterprise worth tens of millions of dollars. But he had made one critical miscalculation. His psychological profile assumed that I would respond to threats with retreat and submission. Instead, I was responding with strategic thinking and careful planning. Tomorrow, while Brandon believed I was grieving and accepting my fate, I would begin the process of documenting evidence that would ultimately destroy everything he had built. The woman he thought he married would have been devastated by discovering his betrayal. The woman I was becoming was grateful for the opportunity to expose crimes that had corrupted Portland's government and harmed countless innocent people. Brandon's greatest strength, his ability to manipulate people through careful psychological calculation, was about to become his greatest vulnerability. And unlike Dr. Jennifer Kim and Marcus Rivera, he would never see the threat coming until it was far too late to respond. The morning of the city council surveillance, I woke before dawn with the kind of nervous energy that made sitting still impossible. Brandon had left for an early breakfast meeting, providing the perfect opportunity to review our surveillance plan one final time. Marcus had identified 3 key locations where Brandon would likely meet with council members before Tuesday's crucial vote on the North Portland rezoning proposal. Using the burner phone Marcus had given me, I confirmed our coordination. He would handle documenting the initial meeting at Councilmember Patricia Zhao's downtown office, while I positioned myself to observe Brandon's lunch with Councilmember David Park at an upscale restaurant in the Pearl District. The third meeting, scheduled for late afternoon with Councilmember Sarah Chen, would take place at a private club where neither Marcus nor I could gain access, but we had arranged for Tessa Kim, a server who worked catering events there, to document what she could safely observe. The complexity of coordinating surveillance on 3 different targets while maintaining my cover as a devastated wife was daunting. But it was also exhilarating. For years I had felt like a passive observer in my own life, responding to Brandon's carefully orchestrated scenarios without understanding the larger context. Now I was actively gathering intelligence that could expose corruption reaching into Portland's highest levels of government. At 9:30, I positioned myself in a coffee shop across from City Hall with a clear view of the building's main entrance. Through the large windows, I watched morning foot traffic while periodically checking the sophisticated camera Marcus had lent me. The device looked like an ordinary tourist camera, but could capture clear images and video from remarkable distances. Brandon arrived at City Hall 20 minutes early, a habit I recognized from our personal life. He always appeared for important meetings with time to spare, using those extra minutes to observe and prepare. Watching him through the camera's viewfinder, I noticed details about his behavior that I had never paid attention to before. The way he surveyed his surroundings before entering buildings, how he positioned himself to maintain visual contact with exits, the careful attention he paid to other people's reactions and body language. These weren't the habits of a logistics company executive. They were the behaviors of someone accustomed to operating in situations where personal security and information control were constant concern. Councilmember Zhao arrived 15 minutes after Brandon, walking quickly from the parking garage with the purposeful stride of someone trying to minimize exposure. She glanced around nervously before entering the building, and I managed to capture several clear photographs of her obvious anxiety. The meeting lasted exactly 45 minutes. When they emerged, Brandon and Zhao exited separately, with Brandon leaving first and Zhao waiting several minutes before following. Their body language suggested a transaction had been completed rather than a routine political consultation. Zhao's earlier nervousness had been replaced by what looked like resignation, while Brandon displayed the confident satisfaction of someone whose expectations had been met. As Brandon walked toward his car, I photographed him checking his phone and making a brief call. Even from a distance, his relaxed posture and casual gestures indicated that the first phase of his day had proceeded according to plan. Following Brandon to his lunch meeting with Councilmember Park required careful timing and considerable luck with Portland's unpredictable traffic. I had to maintain enough distance to avoid detection while staying close enough to document their interaction at the restaurant. The Pearl District location Brandon had chosen was strategically perfect for a discreet meeting. Upscale enough to seem legitimate, but busy enough to provide cover for sensitive conversation. I arrived at the restaurant 10 minutes before Brandon's scheduled lunch, securing a table with a sightline to the private dining area where he would likely meet with Park. The hostess was accommodating when I explained that I was waiting for a business associate and preferred a quiet corner table where we could discuss confidential matters. Councilmember Park arrived first, requesting the same private dining area I had anticipated. He appeared significantly more nervous than Zhao had been, repeatedly checking his phone and looking toward the restaurant's entrance. When Brandon joined him, their greeting was cordial but restrained, suggesting a professional relationship rather than a personal friendship. From my position across the dining room, I could observe their interaction without being able to hear specific conversations, but their body language told a compelling story. Park spent the first 15 minutes of their lunch leaning forward intently, occasionally shaking his head or gesturing in ways that suggested disagreement or reluctance. Brandon remained calm and composed, occasionally sliding papers across the table for Park to examine. The turning point came when Brandon showed Park something on his phone. Whatever image or information he displayed caused Park's entire demeanor to change. His shoulders sagged, his face went pale, and he suddenly became very still. Brandon put his phone away and continued eating calmly while Park stared at his untouched plate. The remainder of their lunch proceeded with Park nodding occasionally while Brandon spoke in measured tones. By the time they finished eating, Park's body language suggested complete capitulation. When they shook hands before leaving, Park's grip appeared weak and his expression defeated. I managed to photograph their entire interaction, capturing Park's transformation from reluctant participant to resigned compliant. The images wouldn't prove specific crimes, but they clearly documented a meeting where pressure was applied and resistance was overcome. Between the lunch surveillance and our planned evening observation of Brandon's meeting with Councilmember Chen, I had several hours to process what I had witnessed and prepare for the next phase of our investigation. Marcus and I met briefly at a different coffee shop to compare notes from our morning surveillance efforts. Zhao's meeting followed exactly the pattern we expected, Marcus reported, reviewing his photographs on a tablet. Brandon arrived with a briefcase. They spent most of their time examining documents, and she left looking like someone who had just agreed to something she didn't want to do. I showed Marcus my photographs from the Park lunch, particularly the sequence showing Park's reaction to whatever Brandon had displayed on his phone. This looked like classic blackmail to me. Park was resistant until Brandon showed him something. Then he completely folded. Marcus studied the images carefully. This is exactly what we needed to document. We're establishing a clear pattern of Brandon meeting privately with council members immediately before crucial votes, using what appears to be coercive pressure to influence their decision. The evidence we were gathering was compelling, but it was also circumstantial. Photographs of nervous council members and suggestive body language wouldn't be sufficient to prove criminal conspiracy in federal court. We needed more direct evidence of actual crimes being committed. There's something else we should consider, Marcus said, lowering his voice even though we were sitting in a relatively private corner. Based on the documents you found in Brandon's safe, tonight's meeting with Sarah Chen might be different from the other. He pulled out his notebook and showed me Chen's profile from the blackmail files. Unlike Zhao and Park, whose dossiers contained evidence of financial improprieties and personal indiscretions, Chen's file was notably thin. The documents suggested that Brandon's organization had been unable to develop significant leverage over her. If they can't blackmail Chen into compliance, they might resort to different methods of persuasion, Marcus explained, the kind of methods that could put her in physical danger. The implication was chilling. If Brandon's network was willing to cause car accidents and arrange suicides to eliminate threats, they might also be prepared to use violence against uncooperative public officials. Chen's meeting tonight could be less about negotiation and more about delivering ultimatums backed by threats of serious harm. We need to reconsider our surveillance approach, I said, understanding the implication. If Chen is in actual danger, we might need to intervene rather than just document. Marcus nodded grimly. Tessa Kim is positioned to observe the meeting, but she's just a server. She can't protect Chen if the situation turns violent, and we can't ask her to take that kind of risk. The ethical dilemma was complex. Our primary goal was gathering evidence to expose Brandon's conspiracy, but we also had a responsibility to prevent harm to innocent people. If we believed Chen was in danger and failed to act, we would be complicit in whatever happened to her. After considerable discussion, we developed a modified plan that balanced our investigative goals with Chen's safety. Tessa would maintain her position as a server to document the meeting, but Marcus would be positioned outside the private club with the ability to contact law enforcement if the situation appeared to escalate beyond verbal pressure. I would monitor Brandon's communications using techniques Marcus had taught me, looking for any indications that violence was being planned or discussed. The private club where Brandon was meeting Chen occupied the top 2 floors of a historic building in Northwest Portland. The Meridian Club had been a gathering place for the city's elite for over a century, providing a discreet environment where powerful individuals could conduct sensitive business away from public scrutiny. Membership was limited to influential politicians, business leaders, and professionals who valued privacy and exclusivity. Tessa Kim had been working catering events at the Meridian Club for 3 years, giving her detailed knowledge of the building's layout and the club's security procedure. More importantly, she had developed relationships with staff members who could provide information about specific meetings and their participants. The club has several private dining rooms, Tessa explained when we met to finalize our plan. Based on the reservation information, Brandon has booked the Cascade Room, which is on the second floor with windows overlooking the street. If Marcus positions himself in the building across the street, he should be able to see into the room with binoculars. She handed Marcus a floor plan of the club that she had sketched from memory. The Cascade Room has only one entrance, so anyone going in or out has to pass through the main dining area where I'll be working. I can observe who arrives, how long they stay, and what their demeanor is when they leave. The coordination required precise timing and careful communication. Tessa would be inside the club from 5 o'clock onward, preparing for an evening event that would provide cover for her presence. Marcus would establish his observation position across the street by 6:30, giving him time to set up photographic equipment and confirm his sightline. I would monitor Brandon's communications from our home, maintaining my cover as the grieving wife while tracking any messages or calls that might indicate escalating threats. By 7 o'clock, everyone was in position. Brandon had left our house an hour earlier, claiming he needed to attend a business dinner that might run late. His casual demeanor suggested he viewed tonight's meeting as routine rather than particularly significant, which was either reassuring or deeply concerning depending on what that routine typically involved. Using the monitoring techniques Marcus had taught me, I accessed Brandon's email and text messages through our shared computer network. Most of his communications were mundane business matters, but one exchange with Gregory Walsh caught my attention immediately. Walsh had sent a brief message at 6:15, package delivered to secondary location, ready for tonight's discussion. Brandon's reply was equally cryptic. Excellent. Proceed as discussed. Subject should be receptive to reasonable proposal. The language was deliberately vague, but the timing and context suggested they were discussing Chan's meeting. The reference to a package being delivered to a secondary location was particularly ominous, especially given Walsh's background in private security and the implied threats in Brandon's blackmail file. I immediately sent a coded text to Marcus using the burner phone. Weather conditions changing, storm approaching faster than expected. His response came within minutes. Understood, monitoring situation closely, will adjust plans if necessary. At 7:45, Tessa's first update arrived. BC arrived on time, appeared calm and confident, carrying briefcase and small package. The mention of a package aligned with Walsh's earlier message about a delivery, suggesting that Brandon was bringing something specific to show or give to Chan. Based on the pattern from his earlier meetings, this could be documents proving blackmail material, or evidence of threats against Chan's family or career. 20 minutes later, Tessa sent another update. SC arrived, looked nervous, but determined. Brief conversation with BC in lobby before moving to private room. For the next hour, communications were limited to brief status updates confirming that the meeting was ongoing, and that both participants remained in the private dining room. Marcus reported that he could see figures moving around the room but couldn't make out specific details of their conversation or activities. At 9:30, the situation changed dramatically. Tessa's message was urgent and alarming. SC left room looking distressed, BC following close. She appeared to be crying. BC grabbed her arm in hallway. Marcus's observation from across the street confirmed escalating tension. Physical contact observed. Subject appears to be resisting, preparing to intervene. I was already reaching for my phone to call 911 when the next update arrived from Tessa. SC broke away from BC, running toward club exit, BC not pursuing, but making phone calls. The sequence of events suggested that Chan had refused Brandon's proposals and that he was now implementing alternative measures to ensure her compliance. The phone call he was making could be activating threats against Chan's family, arranging for additional pressure to be applied, or coordinating with Walsh's security team to pursue other forms of intimidation. Marcus's next message confirmed my fears. BC emerging from building, getting into vehicle with 2 other men, appears to be following SC's route. The situation was rapidly escalating beyond surveillance into active pursuit. Chan was fleeing what appeared to be threats or coercion, while Brandon and his associates were following her. Whatever had transpired in that private dining room had pushed the situation beyond negotiation into the realm of active intimidation, or worse. I called Marcus directly on the burner phone. "We need to contact law enforcement immediately. This has moved beyond documentation." "Agreed," Marcus replied, his voice tight with tension. "I'm calling Detective Sandra Martinez at Portland Police. She's one of the few people I trust not to be compromised by local corruption. Can you track Chen's location?" Using resources I never imagined I would need as a nonprofit arts administrator, I began monitoring emergency services, communications and news feeds for any reports of incidents involving local politicians. The next 30 minutes felt like hours, as Marcus coordinated with Detective Martinez, while I searched for any indication of Chen's whereabouts or condition. At 10:45, Marcus called with both relief and new concerns. "Martinez found Chen at her home. She's physically safe, but extremely shaken. She's agreed to speak with federal investigators about tonight's meeting, but she's also terrified about potential retaliation." The breakthrough was significant, but incomplete. We had documented clear evidence of Brandon attempting to coerce a public official, and we had a witness willing to testify about the specific threats that were made. But we also had confirmation that Brandon's organization was prepared to use physical intimidation and stalking to enforce compliance. "What did Chen tell Martinez about the meeting?" I asked. Brandon showed her photographs of her teenage daughter leaving school and detailed information about her daily routine. He also had financial records proving that Chen's husband has been evading taxes on income from freelance consulting work. The message was clear: vote for the rezoning proposal, or face consequences that would destroy both her family's safety and their financial security. The systematic nature of the threats was chilling. Brandon hadn't just gathered blackmail material on Chen herself. He had researched her entire family to identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The photographs of her daughter were particularly sinister, implying that even children weren't off limits for retaliation. Martinez is arranging for Chen and her family to have protective surveillance, while federal investigators review the case. Marcus continued, "But this also means our window for gathering additional evidence is closing rapidly. Once Brandon realizes that Chen has contacted law enforcement, he'll begin destroying evidence and possibly eliminating other potential witnesses." The urgency was overwhelming. We had made crucial progress in documenting Brandon's criminal activities, but we had also triggered a response that could put multiple people in danger. Chen's courage in refusing to be intimidated had provided the breakthrough we needed, but it had also accelerated the timeline for everything that followed. As I sat in my house waiting for Brandon to return from his failed attempt to coerce Chen, I realized that our investigation had reached a critical turning point. We had gathered enough evidence to interest federal investigators, but we hadn't yet collected sufficient proof to guarantee conviction. The next few days would determine whether Brandon's conspiracy could be exposed and prosecuted, or whether it would simply adapt and continue operating with greater secrecy. More immediately, I needed to maintain my cover as the unsuspecting wife while Brandon dealt with the fallout from Chen's refusal to cooperate. His psychological profile suggested I would remain focused on our divorce proceedings, rather than asking questions about his business activity. But if he suspected I was involved in tonight's surveillance, or Chen's decision to contact law enforcement, my own safety could be in jeopardy. When Brandon finally returned home at 11:30, his demeanor was noticeably different from his usual calculated composure. He moved through the house with sharp, efficient gestures that suggested controlled anger. His phone rang repeatedly and his responses to callers were brief and tense. "Difficult evening?" I asked with the sympathetic tone of a wife concerned about her husband's business stress. "Some people don't appreciate reasonable business proposals," Brandon replied, his voice carrying an edge I had rarely heard before. "But there are always alternative approaches to achieving necessary outcomes." The veiled threat in his words was unmistakable. Chen's refusal had been noted, and alternative measures were being considered. As Brandon continued his phone conversations in his home office, I listened carefully to the fragments of conversation I could overhear, references to adjusting timelines, implementing backup protocols, and managing exposure risks suggested that Brandon's organization was shifting into crisis mode. Chen's resistance had disrupted their careful plans for controlling Tuesday's city council vote, and they were now scrambling to maintain control of the situation. The most chilling phrase I overheard was Brandon's instruction to someone about ensuring that other council members understand the importance of maintaining previous commitment. The implication was clear: if Chen couldn't be intimidated into compliance, additional pressure would be applied to Zhao and Park to ensure their votes remained secure. As I prepared for bed while Brandon continued his crisis management calls, I realized that our investigation had evolved far beyond documenting corruption. We were now actively disrupting a criminal conspiracy that had operated with impunity for years. The evidence we had gathered could bring down powerful individuals and expose systematic abuse of public trust. But we had also made ourselves targets of an organization that had already demonstrated its willingness to use violence against threats to its operation. The woman who had discovered Brandon's safe just days ago had been seeking evidence of marital infidelity. The woman going to sleep in the same house as a man coordinating criminal retaliation was preparing for a confrontation that would determine not just the future of Portland's government, but potentially her own survival. Tomorrow's city council vote would reveal whether our intervention had been successful in disrupting Brandon's conspiracy, or whether his organization's alternative methods of ensuring compliance would prove equally effective. Either way, the careful psychological manipulation that had controlled my life for 8 years was about to be replaced by something far more dangerous and unpredictable. The morning after Chen's confrontation, I woke to find Brandon already gone from the house, his absence marked only by an empty coffee cup in the sink and the lingering scent of his cologne. A note on the kitchen counter explained that he had left early for urgent meetings that would keep him occupied most of the day. The casual tone of the message contrasted sharply with the tense phone conversations I had overheard the night before. Using the burner phone, I contacted Marcus to coordinate our next phase of surveillance. Tuesday's city council vote was now just 18 hours away, and we needed to document how Brandon's organization would respond to Chen's refusal to cooperate. The vote would reveal whether their backup strategies could maintain control over the rezoning decision, or whether Chen's courage had disrupted their carefully orchestrated corruption. Federal agent Rebecca Torres from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit contacted me this morning, Marcus reported when we met at a small diner in Southeast Portland. Detective Martinez forwarded our evidence, and Torres is very interested in what we've uncovered. But she needs more than circumstantial evidence and witness testimony to build a federal case. Agent Torres had reviewed the photographs from Brandon's safe, Marcus's documentation of the corruption network, and Chen's statement about the threats she had received. While the evidence clearly suggested systematic criminal activity, federal prosecutors would need proof of specific crimes that violated federal statutes. Torres wants us to continue gathering intelligence, but with FBI oversight and support, Marcus continued. She's arranging for sophisticated surveillance equipment and backup agents who can intervene if situations become dangerous. We're no longer operating alone. The prospect of federal support was both reassuring and concerning. Professional law enforcement resources would make our investigation more effective and safer, but FBI involvement also meant that the stakes had escalated dramatically. We were no longer just exposing local corruption, we were participating in a federal criminal investigation that could result in decades of prison sentences for everyone involved. There's something else Torres told me that changes our timeline, Marcus said, lowering his voice even though the diner was nearly empty. 3 months ago, the Justice Department opened a broader investigation into organized crime connections between Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver. They believe Brandon's network might be connected to international money laundering operations that involve drug trafficking and human smuggling. The revelation transformed my understanding of what we had discovered. Brandon's Northwest Development Consortium wasn't just manipulating local zoning decisions for profit. It was potentially providing money laundering services for criminal organizations operating across international borders. The millions of dollars flowing through their accounts might represent proceeds from activities far more serious than development fraud. If that's true, then everyone involved in this conspiracy is facing potential life sentences rather than just corruption charges, I said, feeling the weight of implications I hadn't previously considered. Marcus nodded grimly, which means they'll do whatever is necessary to prevent exposure. Chen's refusal to cooperate didn't just disrupt a local development scheme, it threatened an operation worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Agent Torres had provided Marcus with encrypted communication devices and surveillance equipment that would allow federal investigators to monitor our activities in real time. If Brandon's organization escalated to violence, FBI agents would be positioned to respond immediately. But the enhanced security also meant that our every movement would be scrutinized by federal law enforcement. Torres wants to meet with you personally this afternoon, Marcus explained. She needs to understand your motivations and assess whether you can handle the psychological pressure of maintaining your cover while participating in an active federal investigation. The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock at a secure location near the federal building downtown. Agent Torres had emphasized that once I formally agreed to cooperate with the FBI investigation, there would be no option to withdraw if the situation became uncomfortable or dangerous. Federal witnesses in organized crime cases were protected but also committed to seeing prosecutions through to completion. Driving to meet Agent Torres, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed in less than a week. 7 days ago, I had been a nonprofit arts administrator, married to a successful logistics executive, focused on mundane concerns about career development and social obligation. Now I was preparing to become an undercover federal informant in an investigation that could expose international criminal conspiracy. The woman who had married Brandon 8 years ago would have been terrified by these developments, and probably would have fled rather than confronting such dangerous opposition. But discovering the truth about Brandon's activities and the systematic manipulation I had endured had fundamentally changed how I understood myself and my capability. Agent Rebecca Torres was younger than I had expected, probably in her mid-30s, with the kind of alert intensity that suggested extensive experience in complex criminal investigation. She met me in a small conference room that had been swept for electronic surveillance, ensuring our conversation couldn't be monitored by Brandon's organization. Mrs. Hoffman, I want to be completely direct with you about what we're asking and what the risks involve, Torres began, spreading photographs and documents across the conference table. Your husband's organization has been operating for at least 5 years, has corrupted multiple levels of local government, and has connections to criminal networks that we're still mapping. Exposing them will require months of careful investigation and considerable personal danger for anyone involved. She indicated a chart showing connections between Brandon's Northwest Development Consortium and various financial entities. Red lines linked the consortium to shell companies in the Cayman Islands, Swiss banks, and holding companies in Vancouver that were already under investigation for money laundering. We believe your husband's development fraud is just one component of a much larger operation, Torres continued. Property purchases and zoning decisions provide opportunities to convert illegally obtained money into legitimate real estate assets. The corruption you've documented enables that laundering process by ensuring favorable decisions regardless of normal regulatory oversight. The complexity of the criminal enterprise was staggering. Brandon wasn't just stealing money through development schemes, he was helping international criminals convert drug proceeds and human trafficking profits into legitimate investment. The blackmail files on local politicians ensured that regulatory oversight couldn't interfere with laundering operations. What we need from you is continued access to Brandon's activities and communications, Torres explained. Your position as his wife provides intelligence opportunities that we can't replicate through traditional surveillance. But maintaining that access means continuing to live with him and interact normally while knowing that he's involved in activities that have resulted in violence against other people. The psychological challenge was daunting. Sharing meals and conversations with Brandon while knowing about his criminal activities would require constant emotional control and careful performance. One mistake in maintaining my cover could expose the entire federal investigation and put multiple lives at risk. I also need you to understand that once we move to arrest phase, your marriage and your life in Portland will be over, Torres continued. Federal witnesses in organized crime cases typically require relocation and new identities for their protection. You're not just risking immediate physical danger, you're potentially giving up your entire previous existence. The finality of that prospect was sober. Exposing Brandon's conspiracy would mean abandoning my career, my friends, my home, and every aspect of the life I had built over the past decade. Even if the prosecutions were successful, I would never be able to return to the person I had been before discovering that But as I considered the alternative, allowing Brandon's criminal network to continue corrupting Portland's government while facilitating international money laundering, the choice became clear. The life I thought I had been living was already gone, destroyed by the revelation of systematic deception and manipulation. What remained was the opportunity to ensure that the truth was exposed and that justice was served. I'm committed to seeing this through, I told Torres. But I need to know that the investigation will be thorough enough to expose everyone involved, not just the most visible participants. Torres nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of determination we need, and I can assure you that this investigation extends far beyond Portland. We're coordinating with federal agencies in 3 countries to map the entire network your husband's organization supports. Over the next hour, Torres briefed me on the surveillance protocols and communication procedures that would govern my role as a federal informant. I would maintain regular contact with the FBI through encrypted devices, document Brandon's activities using equipment provided by federal agents, and report any indications of escalating threats or violence. Most crucially, I would need to find opportunities to access Brandon's office and computer systems to gather evidence of financial transactions and communications with international partners. The safe I had discovered was just one repository of evidence. Brandon likely maintained additional records that could prove the connections Torres needed to build her federal case. Tomorrow's city council vote will be our first test of how Brandon's organization responds to serious disruption, Torres explained. If Chen's refusal forces them to abandon the rezoning proposal, they might accelerate other operations to compensate for lost revenue. If they find ways to maintain control despite Chen's opposition, they'll become more confident about their ability to manage threats. Either outcome would provide valuable intelligence about the network's capabilities and backup strategy, but the vote would also reveal how far Brandon's organization was willing to go to protect operations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Returning home that afternoon, I found Brandon in his office engaged in what appeared to be crisis management communication. Through the partially open door, I could see him reviewing financial documents while conducting phone conversations in the careful, measured tones he used for particularly sensitive business matters. The timeline has been adjusted, I heard him tell someone. Secondary protocols are now in effect, and all participants have been notified of revised expectations. The language was deliberately obscure, but the context suggested that Chen's refusal had triggered contingency plans that Brandon's organization had prepared for exactly such disruption. Whatever those secondary protocols involved, they were being implemented with the efficiency of an operation that had anticipated and planned for resistance. When Brandon emerged from his office an hour later, his demeanor had returned to the controlled composure I recognized from our normal domestic interaction. The crisis management intensity I had observed was replaced by the careful attention and consideration he displayed when managing my responses to difficult situations. "I'm sorry I've been so preoccupied with work lately," he said, settling beside me on the living room couch with the relaxed gesture of someone whose professional problems had been resolved. "I know the divorce proceedings are stressful enough without me being distracted by business issues." The performance was masterful, concerned husband acknowledging legitimate grievances, while providing reasonable explanations for behavior that might otherwise prompt inconvenient questions. If I hadn't spent the afternoon learning about international money laundering investigations, I might have been touched by his apparent consideration. "Is everything resolved now?" I asked with the tone of a wife showing appropriate interest in her husband's professional challenge. "Most of the immediate concerns have been addressed," Brandon replied. "Tomorrow's meetings should finalize the remaining details, and then things can return to normal schedules." The reference to tomorrow's meetings was significant. Tuesday's city council vote was scheduled for 7 o'clock in the evening, but Brandon was apparently planning additional activities that would determine how his organization responded to whatever decisions the council made. "I might be working late again tomorrow evening," he continued. "There's a dinner meeting that could run quite late." depending on how productive the discussions are. The timing suggested that Brandon would be monitoring the city council vote and coordinating his organization's response based on the outcome. If Chen maintained her opposition and convinced other council members to reject the rezoning proposal, Brandon would need to implement whatever secondary protocols he had referenced in his phone conversation. That evening, as Brandon worked in his office, finalizing preparations for the next day's activities, I used the encrypted communication device Torres had provided to report his apparent plan. Federal agents would be positioned to monitor his movements and document whatever response his organization implemented. The surveillance plan Torres had outlined was comprehensive but also extremely dangerous. FBI agents would track Brandon's activities while I maintained my position inside his personal life, gathering intelligence about decisions and communications that external surveillance couldn't access. If Brandon suspected federal investigation or realized that I was cooperating with law enforcement, the consequences could be immediately life-threatening. But the alternative was allowing an international criminal network to continue operating with impunity, while corrupting Portland's government and facilitating crimes that harmed innocent people throughout the Pacific Northwest. Chen's courage in refusing to be intimidated had created an opportunity to expose and prosecute the entire conspiracy, but only if that opportunity was pursued with determination and strategic intelligence. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of gray drizzle that characterizes Portland winters, creating an appropriately somber atmosphere for what would likely be a decisive day in our investigation. Brandon left the house early, claiming he needed to attend meetings that would prepare him for evening business obligations. His departure provided an opportunity to access his office and gather additional evidence using the sophisticated surveillance equipment Torres had provided. The device Torres had given me looked like an ordinary smartphone but contained software that could access computer networks, copy files, and monitor communications without leaving traces of intrusion. Using Brandon's home office computer, I was able to download financial records, email communications, and calendar information that revealed the scope of activities planned for the next several weeks. The financial records confirmed Torres's suspicions about international money laundering operations. Transfers worth millions of dollars had moved through Northwest Development Consortium accounts over the past 6 months, with funds originating from sources in Vancouver, Seattle, and several Caribbean banking centers, known for facilitating financial crime. More disturbing were calendar entries that suggested Brandon's organization was planning to expand operations significantly over the next quarter. Property acquisitions in 3 different cities, meetings with officials in Vancouver and Seattle, and coordination with shipping companies that could facilitate import-export activities that bypassed normal customs oversight. The email communications revealed that Chan's refusal had indeed triggered contingency plans, but those plans were more comprehensive than I had anticipated. Rather than simply finding alternative ways to influence Tuesday's vote, Brandon's organization was accelerating multiple operations to compensate for potential disruption of their Portland activities. If local political control becomes unreliable, we shift primary operations to Vancouver and Seattle while maintaining Portland as a secondary location, one email explained. All major financial transfers should be completed within 60 days to minimize exposure if investigations develop. The message suggested that Brandon's network was preparing to abandon Portland entirely if they couldn't maintain sufficient control over local government decisions. Rather than fighting to preserve their current operations, they were planning to relocate critical activities to locations where they faced less scrutiny. As I copied the evidence to encrypted storage devices Torres had provided, I realized that our investigation had identified a criminal enterprise that was both more extensive and more adaptable than anyone had anticipated. Exposing Brandon's Portland operations might not destroy the network, it might simply force them to relocate and continue their activities elsewhere. That afternoon, Marcus contacted me with intelligence from federal agents who had been monitoring suspected network locations throughout the day. Unusual activity had been observed at multiple sites, including increased security presence, document destruction at several offices, and meetings between key participants who normally avoided direct contact. Torres believes they're implementing a controlled shutdown of Portland operations. Marcus reported. If tonight's vote goes against them, they're prepared to abandon local activities and shift to backup locations that are already established. The revelation was both encouraging and frustrating. Our investigation had been successful enough to threaten their Portland operations, but the network's sophistication meant that prosecution might be difficult if key evidence was destroyed before arrests could be made. Torres wants you to maintain surveillance on Brandon throughout the evening. Marcus continued. If they're planning to abandon Portland operations, tonight might be our last opportunity to gather evidence before they relocate critical activities and personnel. The evening would require careful coordination between my domestic surveillance and the federal agents monitoring Brandon's business activity. As Brandon prepared for what he believed would be routine crisis management, I would be documenting evidence that could determine whether years of criminal activity could be successfully prosecuted, or whether an international network would simply adapt and continue operating elsewhere. Tuesday's City Council meeting was scheduled to begin at 7 o'clock, with the North Portland rezoning proposal listed as the evening's primary agenda item. By 6:30, I was positioned in our living room with a clear view of Brandon's office, while monitoring federal communications about the surveillance operations that were tracking his associates throughout the city. Brandon emerged from his office at 6:45, dressed in the kind of expensive casual attire he typically wore for important but unofficial business meetings. His demeanor was calm and confident, suggesting that whatever outcomes the evening might produce, he was prepared to manage them effectively. I'll probably be quite late tonight, he told me, collecting car keys and a briefcase with the efficient movements of someone following a carefully planned schedule. Don't wait up tomorrow, we can discuss more details about the divorce timeline. The casual reference to our divorce proceedings was jarring in the context of everything I now knew about his criminal activity. While Brandon focused on managing international money laundering operations and political corruption, he was also maintaining the domestic fiction that our marriage was ending due to ordinary compatibility issues. As Brandon's car disappeared into Portland's evening traffic, I settled in to monitor federal communications, while maintaining the appearance of a woman spending a quiet evening at home. Tonight would reveal whether our investigation had been successful in disrupting a criminal network, or whether Brandon's organization was sophisticated enough to adapt and continue operations despite federal scrutiny. The next few hours would determine not just the outcome of a city council vote, but potentially the fate of an international conspiracy that had corrupted governments and facilitated serious crimes throughout the Pacific Northwest. Whatever happened, the woman who had discovered a hidden safe less than a week ago was about to learn whether her courage in exposing the truth would be sufficient to ensure that justice was served. The city council chamber was packed with residents opposing the North Portland rezoning when the meeting began at 7 o'clock. From my position monitoring federal communications at home, I could track both the public proceedings and the private activities that would determine the evening's real outcome. Agent Torres provided real-time updates as FBI surveillance teams followed Brandon and his associates throughout Portland. Target 1 entering City Hall through rear entrance came the first report at 7:50. Brandon had arrived at the building but was avoiding the public areas where residents and media were gathered. His choice to use service entrances suggested he planned to influence tonight's proceedings without being observed by community members who opposed the rezoning. The vote itself was almost anticlimactic. Council member Chen maintained her opposition despite whatever additional pressure Brandon's organization might have applied since our surveillance had disrupted their initial intimidation attempt. Council member Zhao voted as expected to support the rezoning, her decision clearly influenced by the blackmail evidence Brandon possessed. But Council member Park surprised everyone by joining Chen in opposition, his vote apparently motivated by concerns about the threats his family might face if he continued cooperating with Brandon's network. Rezoning proposal fails 3 votes to 2, Marcus reported through encrypted communications. Chen and Park held firm. Brandon's operation has suffered a significant defeat. The vote's outcome represented a meaningful victory against corruption, but it also triggered the response protocols Brandon's organization had prepared for exactly this contingency. Within minutes of the vote's conclusion, federal surveillance teams reported urgent communications between network members and immediate implementation of what appeared to be evacuation procedures. Multiple vehicles departing Target 1's secondary office location, Agent Torres reported. Personnel removing boxes and computer equipment, appears to be systematic evidence destruction and facility abandonment. The speed and efficiency of their response demonstrated that Brandon's network had prepared extensively for the possibility that their Portland operations might be compromised. Rather than fighting to maintain local control, they were executing a coordinated withdrawal that would preserve personnel and critical assets, while abandoning activities that could be traced by federal investigators. From Brandon's perspective, tonight's vote hadn't just been a business setback, it had been a test of whether his organization could maintain sufficient political control to continue operating safely in Portland. Park's unexpected opposition, combined with Chen's continued resistance, proved that their corruption network was no longer reliable enough to justify the security risks of maintaining major operations in the city. Target 1 departing City Hall, proceeding toward waterfront location, came the next surveillance update. Brandon was heading toward the industrial area near the Willamette River, where several companies connected to Northwest Development Consortium maintained office and warehouse facilities. Federal agents had identified these locations as probable centers for money laundering and evidence storage. At 8:45, the situation escalated dramatically. Target 1 meeting with multiple associates at warehouse complex. Charlie observed loading trucks with file boxes and computer equipment. Heavy security presence suggests high-value cargo. The warehouse operation was clearly the evacuation center where Brandon's organization was consolidating evidence and assets, before relocating to backup facilities in other cities. Federal agents had legal authority to observe but couldn't intervene without sufficient evidence of crimes in progress. "Torres wants you to attempt contact with Target 1, Marcus relayed through encrypted channel. Domestic call expressing concern about his late evening could provide opportunity to assess his psychological state and gather intelligence about timeline for evacuation. The request required careful consideration. Calling Brandon during what was obviously a crisis management operation risked exposing my knowledge of his activities, but it also provided an opportunity to document his state of mind and potentially gather information about his organization's plan. I called Brandon's cell phone at 9 o'clock, using the concerned tone of a wife checking on her husband's unexpectedly late evening. The phone rang several times before he answered, and background noise suggested he was in an environment with multiple people and considerable activity. "Sorry, I'm still tied up with work issues," Brandon said, his voice carrying tension that contrasted sharply with his usual controlled composure. "Tonight's meetings are running much later than anticipated." "Is everything all right?" I asked, allowing appropriate worry to color my voice. "You sound stressed." "Just some complications that require immediate attention," he replied. "I might need to travel for business over the next few days. We may need to postpone some of our divorce discussions until I return." The reference to business travel aligned with federal intelligence suggesting that Brandon was preparing to relocate operations. His mention of postponing divorce proceedings indicated that maintaining domestic normalcy was becoming a lower priority than managing the criminal enterprise's crisis response. "Where are you traveling?" I asked, trying to sound like a wife asking routine questions about her husband's schedule. "Vancouver initially, then possibly Seattle," Brandon answered. "Client situations that require personal attention." The destinations confirmed federal suspicions about backup operational centers in both cities. Brandon's willingness to provide specific locations suggested either that he trusted my domestic disinterest in his business activities, or that he was sufficiently distracted by crisis management to be less careful about operational security. "I should go," Brandon continued. "These meetings are requiring my full attention. We'll talk more when I return." The call ended abruptly, leaving me with confirmation that Brandon was indeed implementing evacuation protocols and preparing to abandon Portland operations. His stress and distraction during our conversation indicated that the network was under more pressure than they had anticipated when developing their contingency plans. Federal communications confirmed that the warehouse evacuation was accelerating. Multiple trucks departing warehouse complex Charlie. License plates suggest vehicles registered to companies in Vancouver and Seattle. Coordinated convoy movement toward Interstate 5 northbound. The convoy represented years of evidence and operational assets being relocated beyond the reach of Portland-based federal investigation. Unless arrests could be made before the evacuation was completed, Brandon's organization might successfully escape prosecution by moving critical personnel and evidence to jurisdictions where they faced less scrutiny. Torres is requesting federal warrants for immediate arrests. Marcus reported, "She believes we have sufficient evidence to charge key participants with conspiracy and money laundering, but prosecutors want stronger proof of specific federal crimes." The legal challenge was complex. While our investigation had documented extensive circumstantial evidence of criminal activity, federal prosecutors needed proof of specific violations that could withstand challenges from expensive defense attorneys. Blackmail of local officials and development fraud were primarily state-level crimes, unless connections to interstate or international activities could be proven definitively. At 10:30, the situation reached a critical turning point. Federal surveillance teams reported that Brandon and several associates had departed the warehouse complex and were heading toward Portland International Airport. Intelligence suggested they were planning immediate departure for Vancouver, where they could coordinate the network's relocation beyond the reach of U.S. law enforcement. "This is our last opportunity for arrest before they reach international airspace," Torres warned through encrypted communications. "But we need something concrete that justifies detention without risking dismissal of charges." The solution came from an unexpected source. During our investigation, we had documented Brandon's systematic threats against Councilmember Chen and her family, including photographs of her teenage daughter and detailed surveillance of her daily routine. Those threats constituted federal crimes under laws protecting public officials and their families from intimidation and stalking. Federal agents are moving to arrest Brandon and associates at PDX. Marcus reported at 11 o'clock. Charges include conspiracy to commit extortion, stalking of federal officials' family members, and money laundering conspiracy. Torres believes these charges will hold while they build broader cases. The arrests represented a crucial victory, but they also triggered immediate danger for me. Once Brandon was taken into custody, his associates would realize that federal investigators had access to inside information about their activities. The most likely source of that intelligence was someone with intimate access to Brandon's private communications and personal activity. "You need to evacuate your residence immediately," Torres instructed through emergency communications. "Network associates are likely to target anyone who might have provided information to federal investigators. We have safe house facilities prepared for your protection." The instruction meant abandoning not just my physical home but every aspect of the life I had built in Portland. Within hours, I had transformed from a woman discovering marital infidelity to a federal witness requiring protection from international criminals. The hidden safe that had started this journey had led to exposing corruption that reached far beyond anything I could have imagined. As federal agents arrived to escort me to protective custody, I took one final look around the house where I had lived for 8 years without understanding the true nature of what was happening around me. The woman who had called this place home had been living in a carefully constructed fiction designed to hide criminal activities worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The arrests at Portland International Airport had prevented Brandon's escape, but they had also revealed the scope of an international network that would require years of investigation to completely dismantle. Councilmember Chen's courage in refusing intimidation had created the opening that made tonight's arrests possible, but federal prosecutors would need extensive additional evidence to ensure convictions that would permanently disable the criminal enterprise. 6 months later, I sat in a federal courthouse in Seattle preparing to testify in proceedings that would determine whether Brandon and 17 associates would face decades in prison for their crime. The investigation had expanded to include charges in 3 countries, with evidence revealing money laundering operations that had facilitated drug trafficking, human smuggling, and weapons sales throughout the Pacific Northwest. The woman who had discovered a hidden safe while packing for divorce had become the key witness in one of the largest organized crime prosecutions in the region's history. My testimony would detail how systematic corruption had infected Portland's government while enabling international criminal networks to operate with impunity. Brandon's psychological profile had predicted that I would retreat rather than fight when confronted with threats to my security and stability. That assessment had proven to be his most catastrophic miscalculation. Instead of accepting manipulation and intimidation, I had chosen to expose the truth regardless of personal consequences. The life I had known in Portland was gone forever, replaced by protective relocation and a new identity that would shield me from retaliation by surviving network members. But the woman testifying in federal court was stronger, more confident, and more purposeful than the person who had married Brandon 8 years earlier. As I walked toward the witness stand to deliver testimony that would help ensure justice for countless victims of the crimes I had helped expose, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. A hidden safe had revealed not just evidence of betrayal but proof that ordinary people could find the courage to confront powerful adversaries when the stakes demanded action. The prosecutor's first question was simple. Ms. Rivera, please tell the court how you discovered the evidence that led to this investigation. I had taken Marcus's surname after our marriage 3 months earlier, symbolizing not just our personal commitment, but also our shared dedication to ensuring that truth prevailed over corruption. The man whose car had been sabotaged for investigating Brandon's network had become my partner in both love and the pursuit of justice. I found a hidden safe while packing my husband's belongings for what I thought would be a routine divorce. I began, my voice steady and clear. What I discovered inside changed not just my understanding of my marriage, but my entire perception of how power and corruption operate in our community. Over the next 6 hours, I detailed every aspect of our investigation, from the initial discovery of blackmail files to the sophisticated money laundering operations that had corrupted Portland's development process. Each piece of evidence I presented represented another step toward ensuring that Brandon's network would never again be able to manipulate democratic institutions for criminal profit. When my testimony concluded, the prosecutor's final question addressed the personal cost of exposing such powerful adversaries. Mrs. Rivera, do you regret the decision to investigate and expose these crimes, given everything you've had to sacrifice? I considered the question carefully before responding. The woman who had lived in comfortable ignorance for 8 years might have chosen safety over truth, but the person I had become understood that some discoveries demanded action regardless of personal consequence. I regret that it took so long for me to understand what was happening around me, I answered. But I don't regret exposing crimes that harmed innocent people and corrupted institutions that are supposed to serve the public interest. Some truths are too important to ignore, even when revealing them requires sacrificing everything you thought you wanted from life. The convictions that followed led to prison sentences ranging from 15 to 40 years for Brandon and his associates. Federal investigators used evidence from our investigation to dismantle related networks in Vancouver and Seattle, while recovering over $200 million in assets that were returned to victims of the crimes we had exposed. Council member Chen continued serving Portland with distinction, her courage in refusing intimidation having inspired broader reforms in city government oversight and The community garden that had nearly been destroyed by corrupt rezoning decisions was preserved and expanded, becoming a symbol of how ordinary citizens could successfully oppose powerful interests when they acted with determination and integrity. For me, the hidden safe had been more than just evidence of betrayal. It had been the key to discovering strength and purpose I never knew I possessed. The comfortable life I had lost was replaced by something far more meaningful. The knowledge that when circumstances demanded courage, I had found the determination to fight for justice regardless of personal cost. Brandon's psychological profile had been wrong about almost everything that mattered. I hadn't retreated when confronted with threats. I hadn't chosen safety over truth. And I hadn't allowed fear to prevent me from taking action when action was necessary to protect innocent people from ongoing harm. The woman who had discovered that safe would spend the rest of her life knowing that when the stakes were highest and the opposition was most powerful, she had chosen to stand up and fight. That knowledge was worth more than any life of comfortable ignorance could ever have provided. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.